thank you, Brona and GrowIN, for the invitation to come along to speak. I'm going to run you through some core concepts that drive our, well, core philosophies and the underpinning concepts that drive how we approach a regenerative agriculture here in Donegal at Future Oak Farm. We're speaking about how we're managing our grazing with a focus on closing water cycles and closing nutrient cycles, and sort of taking an holistic approach to that. It's going to be super simple. Only planning to keep you for about 30 minutes or so, and then at the end, please feel free to ask any questions or any points of clarification. This is designed to be a high level, but I'm more than happy to dive into any kind of details in the questions afterwards.
Yeah.
We are based here by that point of that red arrow, so just to the west of Letterkenny, which is the kind of county seat in Donegal, and that big green splodge that you see is Glen Bay National Park. So it's one of kind of 6 major national parks in the Republic of Ireland, and just in the year before COVID, it was the busiest. Quite funny, they got about 220,000 people visiting the park over the course of that year before COVID. And what's kind of interesting from my perspective is I grew up on this landscape, and the landscape looks like this, which is the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what it looks like. We've been told that this is wild and untamed and beautiful and, you know, kind of peak ecosystem. But the irony is that if you go to the next slide, the Irish name for this area is Nocht de Vaha, which translates as, next slide, the hills of oak and birch. So when I grew up in this landscape, we were a traditional sheep farm, and we were running about 250, 300 sheep at the time, and I had absolutely no interest because I used to chase them over these hills without realizing the kind of negative impact were. And it was only when I was kind of in my mid-20s that I actually realized that there was this translation from Nocht de Vaha, the hills of oak and birch, and began asking the question, you know, kind of where are the oak and birch now? So if we skip on. So Ireland has been systematically deforested since around about the 1600s, and there were many kind of forces at play there, colonialism being a large one. But the real death knell in our part of the world, from that's resulted in the degradation of the temperate Atlantic rainforests that would have covered these hills, are 3 points of inflection. So the last wolf was shot in Ireland in the mid-1700s, and in the absence of a predator, herbivore population increases, and their behavior changes very markedly. Around that time as well, locally here, we had an Anglo landlord who had visions of a big hunting estate. So he reintroduced a non-indigenous red deer population that are still here today, and still causing all sorts of issues. In the absence of predators, they were just turning up the volume on grazing. And then around about the same time, about a couple of decades just after the Highland clearances in Scotland, his ambition was also to clear the land of people, which resulted in the Derry Bay evictions in 1861, and it resulted in the intensification of sheep farming on these hills. So what we've done is we've removed the predators, and we've turned up the volume on two key elements of grazing pressure in this hill, and really that's how you kill a woodland ecosystem. So of course, in a diverse vestige of a woodland system, where you have a mixed age community from mature overstory to young saplings on the ground, it's the saplings that disappear first in this pattern of degeneration. When the saplings go, the older examples of that woodland system continues to get older, and eventually they reach the end of their lifetime if they're not felled before, and there's nothing to replace them. It's really interesting that this pattern of degeneration of the young people, or the young examples of that community, is mimicked in human systems as well, where for young people growing up in these areas, it's deemed that there is no future, so get out as quickly as we can. So if you go on to the next slide. We have 3 core ethics here at Future Oak Farm. The first is to feed ourselves first, our families and friends second, and then our broader communities third. The second is to build complexity. We know that nature builds resilience through diversity and through complexity. So we want to mimic that at every possible stage. And then the third is we realize that spending money is not the way to a profitable operation, no matter what business you're in. So we're looking for a model that can kind of wash its own face and more. So we're looking essentially for a zero input model. And these three core ethics really feed into what we've defined over a number of years as our holistic context. So knowing your context, knowing what you're aiming towards is a really key part of this entire process. Just kind of as an aside, it's worth going down the rabbit hole a bit of what is regenerative anyway. There's a lot of talk at the moment or over the last few years about everyone's jumping on the regenerative bandwagon. So for us, we're keeping track of a number of metrics, including biodiversity in our pasture. We're looking at rooting depth. We're looking at the ability for our soils to infiltrate, and we're looking at that building complexity as a leading indicator on whether or not we're regenerating a system or degenerating a system. Because if you'll excuse the title of this talk and the mention of that word sustainability, which I absolutely abhor, nature doesn't do sustainable. Nature doesn't do flat line in complex systems. So systems are either regenerating and building in complexity day after day, year after year, or they're degenerating. They're in one of these two cycles. So for us, what is a regenerative system? Well, it's one that is demonstrably getting more complex and building capacity and building abundance year on year. Next one, please. So when I left these glens, I was about 19 at the time, and I spent a few years at uni studying mining engineering, and I went into a career in oil and gas exploration, and I never thought I'd be back in the hills again. But I was kind of coming up to 30. I spent 15 years or so in that career and was becoming increasingly dissatisfied with some of the core ethics that were at play. Had a great lifestyle, but was very unfulfilled. And I happened upon this TED talk. I'm not going to go into the details of it because I'm sure most of the people that would tune into an event like this would be somewhat versed on the work of Allan Savory and his holistic management model. But when I saw this decision-making framework and some of the key kind of foundational blocks of this approach, something really resonated with me, and I thought, this is really interesting. So yeah, if you haven't seen it, go over to YouTube, put in this guy's name, and have a look out for the TED talk that starts with this thumbnail, because that's really where it all began for me. Next slide. So underpinning holistic management are these four key insights, which you can view them as kind of lenses through which to view the world. The first there is that nature functions in wholes, which comes back to this old saying that, if you tug on the string of any element of a system, the whole system is interconnected and interwoven. And that's really a point, that holistic kind of perception of systems is really a point that's often missed in oh, that's a fly, is a point that's often missed in scientific reductionist approaches. I know it myself from my career as an engineer. We would take complex dynamic systems, particularly when trying to do really marvelous feats of engineering, and we would set boundary conditions to a complex scenario, call everything outside the boundary conditions externalities and things that we couldn't measure because either we didn't have the mathematical know-how or the computing power at that time, and instead we would look at we would take this reductionist approach. We would reduce a complex system to the simplest number of nodes possible, and then try to predict the behavior through that simplified version through numerical analysis. And really, what ends up happening is when you adopt this reductionist approach, is that you end up with all sorts of unintended consequences that are happening outside of your boundary conditions, and some of these can be really, really fatal, as we've seen in modern agriculture. The second insight then around brittleness scale is about the availability of moisture across 12 months. So on one end of the scale, you have super brittle environments that are lacking the abundance of moisture. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have environments that are completely awash with the availability of moisture across the 12-month period. Here in Donegal, we sit somewhere in the kind of 6, 5 to 6 range, maybe 6 to 7 range on a scale of 1 to 10. The only kind of variable with that is temperature. And this is a really crucial insight because it relates to the rate at which we can decay biological material in ambient conditions. So you can imagine here in Donegal, if we're a wee bit cooler, the rate of biological decay slows down with that drop in ambient temperature. And if we were to turn up the volume on that temperature, move slightly farther south with the availability of moisture, our rate of biological decay would also increase. And this will become it'll become apparent slightly later on why this is hugely important. The third point there, plant and soil recovery time. This is directly related to the work of Andrew Voisin, which was kind of insightful for Savory and for a lot of us, because it really succinctly described the physiological life cycle of grasses and of forage species. And basically it relates to the idea about how quickly forage species will recover and grow through different stages of their growth cycle, from a very juvenile stage through adolescence and through to maturity when the plant itself is looking to set seed, and how our relationship to grazing decisions should be kind of tweaked depending on what stage of the growth cycle that the plant is at. But basically, if you want to boil it down into quite simple terms, it's allowing enough times, you're managing for recovery so that you don't come back and take a second bite of that plant or of that area before a plant has had enough time to fully recover to the stage that it was at before your first bite. And what that means is you're not taking money out of the bank. It's like if you view the development of these forage species in terms of a savings account, you're allowing that savings account to fully replenish, for the plant to fully grow and express itself through its physiological life cycle before you come back and hit it again. If you come back and hit it too early and then you rinse and repeat that cycle, you're just weakening the plant and draining that account to zero at every chance. And then the fourth key insight here is the predator-prey dynamics. This is really interesting because it affects the psychology of the animal. And we'll see why that's important in a little bit. But I grew up in an era watching David Attenborough documentaries of these really epic helicopter shots over the Serengeti, where herds of herbivores, their only protection against predation was to bunch up and keep moving. And you see this behavior in all sorts of kingdoms within the animal world. You see it in fish when they school, you see it in birds and starlings when they go through that murmuration before they roost at night. You see it in animals, in large herbivores on the Serengeti. And basically what it means is animals will bunch together and they're always on the lookout, always trampling, always walking around looking for the threats in the local area. They come into an area and they've got a competition anxiety between the individuals in that pack, and they're not selectively grazing. They're eating whatever they can, whatever's within reach of their mouth, they're eating. Because they're constantly on the move, you get a high degree of trampling, and you get a massive dump of dung and urine in a particular discrete area. And then crucially, that herd moves on because the food stock in that area has been depleted. So part of the predator-prey dynamic is applying the tool of rest to a discrete forage area. So if you move on there, Brenna. So hand in hand with the four insights that we've just mentioned are the ecosystem processes. Water cycle, so how effectively water is moving through our landscape on a macro scale. So where we farm here in Donegal, we're up in the Derry Mountains, and we're actually quite close to the top of the catchment. But what we do up here, I like to tell people to think like a raindrop. So when that raindrop hits the ridgeline above us and decides to fall our way into our catchment through gravity and because of the topography, where is it going? What is its path? So this defines how effective our water cycle is. Unfortunately, in the Republic here, we've got something called the Arterial Drainage Act, which was enacted in the 1950s, which makes it a legal obligation for farmers to get water off their farms as quickly as possible, which is kind of developed into this single-minded mindset of drainage everywhere. And as we'll demonstrate in a few moments, that's not the approach we're taking here. The second key process here is the mineral cycle. So it's how well minerals and nutrients are actually going through our system. So when a plant grows up, it's embodying certain minerals and certain nutrients, and there are mechanisms at play that allow, at the end of its life cycle, that allow those nutrients to go back into the pool, back into the dynamic, complex world of that's beneath our feet, beneath our feet in the living food web of the soil, and become recycled to reincarnate again as different pools of nutrient in other plants. So it's really important that these loops are closed, and the ability for nutrients to pass in and out from one life cycle to another is uninhibited. And unfortunately, in modern agricultural terms, this circular system has been interrupted and broken through a number of mechanisms, and we've supplanted that nutrient cycle with the addition of nitrogen-based fertilizers. And what I always like to say in our climate here, in our wet temperate climate here in Donegal, is if you fix the top two, if you fix water cycle is our biggest point of leverage, then with a slight change in management in terms of how we bunch animals and move them around, and how we're actually managing that grazing planning, if you fix those two, then the bottom two come into play. The bottom two kind of fall into line. So the bottom two being energy flow, so that's how efficiently we're capturing photons from the sun through that photosynthetic process and bringing energy into the system. And then finally, community dynamics is essentially an expression of biodiversity within a biological system or an ecological system. Okay, Bren. Next slide. Oh. So when I came back to Donegal about 10 years ago or so now, and I was kind of armed with this insight, I was full of all sorts of gusto for holistic management, and I started looking around the country for who was doing what, and I certainly couldn't find anybody local who was doing anything like this at all. Everybody was extensively grazing with sheep, and I was looking nationally. I couldn't really find anyone that was doing it, so I thought, Christ, I'll have to do the experiments myself. So at the time, our farm here, which is 120 acres or so, was all leased. I took back 4 acres and borrowed some sheep, and I started running them at ultra high density on some of the poorest pastures on the farm. And when I say the poorest pastures, I took a transect survey, and through quadrats at a sampling interval that allowed me to kind of characterize the pasture. And what we ended up with was a characterization where that pasture was north of 85% dominated with mosses, with very little grass, and certainly no heart within the pasture at all. It was all spindly little seed head and not much forage. But trusting the process and really not risking much, because I was only trialing this on 4 acres and the rest of the farm was still kind of being farmed conventionally by other people. I began running sheep at ultra high density. So I only had 40, 50 sheep at the time, but I was running them at densities between 2,500 sheep to the hectare and 3,500 sheep to the hectare, which looks really weird when you're doing it with 40 sheep, because you're talking about 6 to 12 hour moves. And yeah, sure, it was a bit of a funny thing to be at. But the result was that within one 12-month period, so that's kind of like the tail end of one growing season and the beginning of the next, we took that pasture back to below 20% moss. And we saw a greater diversity of forage species coming through and more vigor in the paddocks. Now, this was without any kind of addition of fertilizers. This was without any kind of addition of seed. This was without any kind of inversion or plowing or anything like that at all. This was literally just animal impact, trampling that biomass, breaking up the cap, the massive dump of dung and urine, and crucially, rest, applying the tool of rest. So we're setting up the conditions. The hooves of the animal and the gut of the animal were acting as ecological triggers, stimulating the system in a very vigorous manner, and then crucially allowing that system to recover. The downside of this was sheep are sheep, and they're really difficult to manage. So to try and achieve those densities was quite a feat, and to be honest, I couldn't stomach it for much more. It was barely manageable on 4 acres on the scale I was doing it at as a test bed, but I knew it didn't have the possibility to scale. So we moved on. So if you go to the next slide, Bren.
It's taken a while to show up on your site.
Sure. There we go. So the next,
Still not. Oh yeah.
so
Yeah.
I had great. I proved the concept. I proved that with this approach we could do something drastically different and achieve something drastically different. So I thought, there's definitely something here. I knew I needed bigger animals, and at the time I was kind of, I had off-farm commitments and wasn't really willing to get into farming full time. And I thought, right, how can I do this? So I knew I needed bigger animals. So a friend of mine had some horses and a couple of donkeys, and I was like, do you know what? I'll try it with these animals, and see if we can achieve different ends or repeat the results, let's say, with heavier animals. The problem with equines is they like to run and they like to move, so you can't really bunch them up and achieve that herd effect with equines in the way you can do with other species. So what we ended up with was some areas that were kind of preferentially grazed and preferentially impacted, and then we would move them on from those areas. So we could prove actually in those areas that they preferred, for whatever reason. It could have been shelter, it could have been access to a water source, or it could have been like some mineral lakes where we were trying to encourage that animal behavior in discrete pockets of area. We were achieving the desired effect, but ultimately over broad acre pastures, the trample was just too inconsistent. So we scaled from 4 acres to 40 acres. We've taken more of the farm back into management, and again proven the concept at a bigger scale. But our chief learning was that equines aren't the right animal. They're not the right tool for the job in our context. If you go to the next slide.
Sorry, it seems to be very slow showing up on your side.
That's okay. Yeah, so we happened upon cattle then, and around about this time, this is about 5 years ago or so, we decided, right, enough was enough. It's time to bite the bullet and get some cattle on the ground. So we did. We started off with a starter herd a couple of years ago, and we ran quite an interesting trial in our first year. So bearing in mind our objective was to bring animals onto the farm that we didn't have to buy additional feed for. So we want to be a zero input system. We want to be building that complexity and doing it in a demonstrable manner. And what we did in our first year was we brought a 50-50 herd on of belted Galloways and Irish Dexter cattle. Dexters are going through this bit of they're very much en vogue the last 10 years or so in Ireland because of the way subsidy systems have worked around heritage breeds. And we thought, well, there must be something to it. Now, for those who don't know, the Dexters are notoriously small animals, and the belted Galloways that we chose to run alongside them through that first winter are around about 150 kilos on the hoof heavier than the Dexters. So we were bunching sort of 25 animals together and moving them all throughout the winter. Far easier to achieve that herd effect. They were easier to train to the line, and they kind of liked being kind of herded in that way. And when I say herd effect, what I mean is if you put them into an area that's too big, they will kind of spread out and they will selectively graze. But if you can, your role as a grazier really is to bunch them up until you get to that point where you see just enough kind of stress within the herd that they begin to feel that competition anxiety between individuals, and that's when they behave differently. And then you're sizing that for the amount of time you want to give them, whether it's daily moves or 2 daily moves or whatever. So that we found them to be far easier to manage, and we carried the Galloways and the Dexters through that first winter, 50% of the herd of each. And our key learning was that the Dexters were just too light, which is a really interesting insight, because farmers in the west of Ireland tend to like them because they're light, because they've got this kind of idea in their head that if a light animal won't poach ground, and of course that's not the case at all. You can poach a ground with a Dexter just as easy as you can with another breed. It all comes down to your day-to-day management. So with the confidence of this, we got rid of the Dexters and we doubled down on the belted Galloways. We'll go in a little bit about why they are a really good fit for our system, and then we scaled up to 120 acres, which is what we're doing now. So if you carry on to the next slide. So in terms of the practical application, we'll go through the mineral cycle here first. Next slide there, Brenna. Just let me know when it comes up on your end.
Oh yeah, it's flicking for me straight away, but I'm not sure if it's my internet connection.
Oh, okay.
It's still not on your end?
There we go. Got it now. Got it now.
Sorry.
So this vista that you see here is very, very common up and down the west coast of Ireland. And what we're looking at is a hillside, which is kind of classified under the modern classification system as a wet heath. So it's on a slope, should be free draining, but what's happened is we've got a heath system which consists of wet grassland species, acid grassland species that have come up. It's gone through their physiological life cycle. They've reached the end of their cycle, so they've completed that kind of seed head stage, for want of a better word, and all of that embodied nutrient is oxidized. So in the absence of an effective trample, all of that embodied nutrient just goes off into the atmosphere and off gases at the end of the season. And what you're left with is this thatch layer. And it's called thatch, just like the cover on traditional houses, because what it does is it prevents light getting down and prevents light hitting the growth tips of the forage species. As you'll know, the fundamental difference between trees and shrubs and grassland forage species is that the growth tips on trees and shrubs are right at the top. So the minute that leader gets up and gets away, you can come and graze the lower limbs, but that tree continues to grow and develop unimpeded as long as that leader stays intact. With a grassland or forage species, its growth tips are right at the base. They're at the basal sprout. So the minute you cut off light to that plant or that assemblage of forage species just goes dormant, and they enter like a phase of stasis. They're not dead, but you just you don't get this you don't get them cycling through another physiological life cycle either in that season or until some kind of disturbance event happens. So traditionally, I remember growing up in this part of the world, and traditionally every summer, usually pretty early in the year, I remember these mountains being set alight, which of course releases a ton of carbon, creates bare ground, and just like completely hits the reset button on habitat for a load of indigenous species. So none of that's a good thing. That's the opposite of building complexity. That's reducing the complexity in the system in the most severe, violent way. So what's the answer here? Well, the answer, if you go to the next slides, as we've already said, this material is oxidizing. So we've actually broken the circularity of this system, which has resulted in an ineffective or broken mineral cycle. If you go to the next one again, Bernard.
Ineffective minerals.
Yeah, so we've got this oxidizing material that's putting the forage species into this stasis, resulting in an ineffective mineral cycle because the minerals and the embodied nutrient isn't being recycled through the biological soil food web. It's now going off and off gassing into the atmosphere. So the answer is on the next slide, which is our cattle. So we need to get animals to behave in a very particular way. We need to bunch them together tight enough. If you just hit forward again one more time, to achieve a trample. And it's the trample that actually hits the reset button and gets that biomass down and in contact with the soil surface. You get the drop of dung and urine, you get the indigenous microorganisms from the soil food web acting from below to digest all of that biomass. And then what happens is the growth tips become uncovered so that the next time the temperature and humidity conditions are right, that plant can enter another phase of its physiological life cycle. It can restart. So what does it look like in practice? If we go ahead to the next slide, Brent.
Yeah.
What does it look like in practice? So this picture that's behind the text here is from our agroforestry system, which is on one particular part of the farm. So day to day, we bunch our animals and keep them moving. You can see there in the third lane up onto the left-hand side, you can just make out the cattle bunched in the corner of a grazing cell. That lane that they're currently in that picture, to the right of it is what they've just come out of. And to the right of that again is 1 day of rest. Below that is 2 days of rest. To the left of that in the middle lane, the middle cell, is 3 days of rest, and so on. So what we're seeing here is kind of a slice through time of grazing impact and recovery. And we're keeping them bunched tight enough to induce that competition and anxiety within the herd, that they've got enough forage in front of them to satiate them for 12 or 24 hours, whatever our defined grazing period is for that window of time. But crucially, we need them stressed enough and kind of in that mindset, in that psychology where they're not being selective about their grazing habits. So when you move them into a new cell, we want them to have that competition anxiety where it's just heads down and you hear that chomp, 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 chomp. The minute they go into a new cell, it's just straight to work. And when we come back, no, we'll talk about that another time, but you want that chomp, chomp. The minute they go into the new cell, you want them heads down. You don't want them looking around in an unhurried fashion. You want to induce that psychology that results in non-selective grazing. And the beauty of this is, when you chunk up your farm into these grazing cells, I like to think about it like a chessboard. So on a chessboard, there's 64 cells, which means that if you gave your herd, regardless of what species you're grazing, access to the entire chessboard, they would kind of psychologically rank the palatability of the species that you've presented to them in that forage, in that pasture mix. And what they're going to do is they're going to go around and selectively seek out the number 1 palatable species, number 2 palatable species, and maybe number 3. And they're going to graze those plants again and again and again, further weakening them. And all of the rest of the species from 4 down to 10 are left kind of unchecked. So the animals aren't bunched tightly enough to really negatively impact their physiological life cycle. They're not being trampled. They're not being interrupted in their growth curve. So they're continuing on to seed. But what's happening to the more palatable species is they're being weakened and weakened and weakened and weakened. So if you extrapolate this behavior over time, what happens is the desirable species in your pasture disappear because they've been overgrazed. They're weakened to the point where they just disappear. And what proliferates are the species that you exactly don't want. These are is when we talk about pastures going poor quality. And in a conventional mindset, what we do is we hit the reset button, right? We go in and we plow it, and we consider options to reseed or to stitch in. Whereas really what we're trying to achieve here is the right density for a defined window of time, that if a plant isn't being eaten and passing through the gut of an animal, it's being trampled. So one way or another, its life cycle is being interrupted. The beauty of moving animals, bunching them and moving them on every day, is that every other square inch of your farm is in rest mode. So every other square inch, apart from what's being grazed on that day 1, is in a state of recovery. Now, what you're going into might have been in recovery for 3 months, or it might have been in recovery for 6 months, or even 12 months on certain parts of our farm. And what you've left behind you, you know that you're not going to get back to it until the plant species that have been grazed have gone through their physiological life cycle again. So they've had a chance to really put on the fat, put down that root development, really grow in vigor. And what we see is year after year, we see the same plant species setting seed head at a much taller state. So when we go into a pasture to regenerate it on the first pass, we might notice that a particular species of plant is setting seed at 4 inches. We'll come in and we'll achieve this trample and graze in the manner that I'm describing. When we come back for a second cycle, we might leave that pasture between 3 months and 6 months. By the time we come back, we notice the same species in the same area are now setting seed at 6 inches or 9 inches. And what this means is that year on year, if we can double the amount of biomass that a plant is putting on before it puts energy into making seed, we've essentially doubled the forage area of that farm on the same unit area. We're growing in some areas, we're growing 2, 3, 4, or 5 times as much biomass, forage biomass per unit area on the farm than we did just a couple of years ago. And because we're grazing on such long rotational cycles and we're promoting this long grass grazing philosophy, we're not coming back and encountering any parasite burden that may be carried by the animal at that critical stage in its life cycle. So parasites will come through the gut of an animal, they'll hit the deck, they'll grow through their larval phase, they'll come out to that next phase where they're ready, looking for another host, and there's nothing there for them. So this long cycle of grazing breaks parasite cycles, and the result is that we do fecal egg counts 3 times a year. We've never had to kind of dose or give any kind of analgesics. Next slide, please, Brenna.
Okay.
So day to day, what does success look like for us? Well, it kind of looks like that picture on the right there, which is a consistent trample. When we come into a paddock, there should be very, very little forage standing up. It should all be kind of on the deck. That's what we're looking for, is like a uniformity of trample right across the soil surface. If we come in to move them out of a paddock after 12 or 24 hours, and we see lots of kind of stalky material, forage material that's left either untrampled or ungrazed, we know that we've given them too much of an area for that particular time period. So we're looking for this consistent trample, almost like a pool table kind of layer. We're looking for a super high density of dung and urine coverage across the entire paddock. And this is really interesting, particularly if you're grazing on ground that's kind of steep or sloped. You'll see that if you're not breaking up that slope in the correct way, you'll see that there are preferential areas on that slope just due to the topography where animals will overgraze certain areas and not touch others. So it becomes really crucial about how and where you place your electric lines. But crucially, what we're looking for is about every yard, about every step, we want to be able to cross that paddock by playing hopscotch from cow pat to cow pat. And that's how we know we've achieved the right kind of density. Crucially, no bare ground. And if we get the first 3 correct, the consistent trample, the density of dung and urine, and we're not creating any kind of bare ground or poaching, what we've done is we've constructed a living compost layer. So any plants that haven't been grazed, they've been trampled and laid down in contact with the soil surface. They've then been inoculated from above by the dung and urine of the herbivores, in our case, the cattle. And crucially, that biomass is now in contact with the soil surface. So any of the indigenous soil food web there can immediately go to work from below, as well as the gut flora and fauna from the animal from above. And that begins composting right in place on a mat. And it's really interesting. On a cold day, if we've done this right, you can get up to a 10-12 degree difference between air temperature at about a meter height and down below that leaf litter layer after a day. So that's the biological activity just going to work immediately. So when we've achieved the trample and we've moved the herd on, it's crucial that we apply the tool of rest. Doing nothing in our scenario is an active decision. We refer to it as applying the tool of rest because we know that we're not coming back to that paddock again before those plants have had a chance to fully recover in a relaxed state and have expressed themselves to at least the point of complexity where they were before we first grazed them. Now, on the farm at the minute, we're massively understocked, but the irony is, as we repair and heal these mineral cycles, our grass or our pasture gets more diverse, but it also gets more vigorous. So our necessary recovery periods are going down and down and down and down. And the problem then becomes you don't have enough animals to keep up with this cycle of regeneration as your pastures get better in quality year on year. So if you'd have asked me kind of 3 years ago, 2 years ago, where I thought the limit of the farm was for a zero input system fully outwintered, I probably would have said about 20 animals. If you're asking me now at this stage of the year, it's probably closer to 45 or 50. So we're constantly chasing that kind of that limit. And basically what it means for us is that our farm has the potential to produce more year on year with no increased input costs, apart from a bit of electric fencing and a bit of time to move them. And because we're allowing the plants to kind of recover in this leisurely fashion, we're not grazing them again and again in quick succession. Their roots also develop. So what we're doing is we're growing that kind of aerobic living soil layer through the rhizosphere as the root development goes deeper and deeper. Because remember, you don't grow big plants on small roots, you don't grow small plants on big roots. So what you see above ground is approximately mirrored below ground. Next slide.
Okay.
And then outwintering, it works exactly the same in the winter, except that when grass is growing slowly, we move them more slowly. So we're grazing stockpile forage right through the year. This picture that's behind us here is of our Rigget bull Mac, and Mac is, you know, he's knocking on for just over the kilo, just over the kind of ton mark, maybe 1,100-1,200 kilos, something like that. And he outwinters no bother on almost every area of the farm. Now there are certain areas that might be really waterlogged just due to the topography and the high rainfall that we get in this part of the world that we wouldn't put him into, but he's doing just fine. So the stockpile forage, we build this kind of, we talk about like a wedge of grass or whatever, but in reality there's big swathes of the farm that are only grazed once a year. And we'll graze slowly through that. And our moves, instead of being 24-hour moves, they're typically about 3-day moves during the winter. We still achieve discrete areas of the desired trample, which of course is shown the next spring in terms of a regenerating grassland system. We see new species popping up and a diversity of species that weren't there before. This is all made possible by mobile infrastructure, of course. So the only fixed fences we have on the farm are the boundary fences to our farm units, and everything else inside that is run on a fixed poly wire. Even our handling facilities, should we need to intervene, which we haven't so far, touch wood, if we need to intervene with any of the animals at all in the field, we use a mobile crush, and we use a hurdle system, which allows us to get wherever the herd are or close to be. And crucially, it's having the right animal for the system. So I mentioned earlier on that we did that trial between Galloways and Dexters, and the thing that edged it for us was the weight of the Galloway and the behavior. They were kind of easier to get into that mindset of non-selective grazing. But crucially, the Galloways develop a winter coat. So in the winter, you'll see them, they get quite fluffy, and the outer coat becomes kind of oily, and they develop a thick undercoat, which is like a downy kind of woolly kind of layer. And that woolly layer traps heat. And we've seen it where we've had temperatures down at sort of -8, -10 on some of the extreme nights a couple of years ago. And we've gone out in the morning, and there's a line of unmelted frost down the back of the animals. And they're nice and leisurely chewing the cud. Like there's no bother on them at all. But crucially, there isn't enough body heat escaping to melt that frost. Now the animals do lose a wee bit of condition over the winter, but we you know, they're healthy and they're vigorous. As I say, you know, they're not carrying any parasite burdens. We do see them lose a wee bit of condition, but crucially, the minute we take them off areas like this and put them back onto grass, they're unrecognizable in 4 or 5 days. They just really bulk out again. So that's how we know they're the right fit for our system. Next one there, Bruna.
Yeah.
So we've spoken about nutrient cycles there. Water cycles are the next big one, and for me, this is the big point of leverage. Everything that we do with our day-to-day grazing management is all about promoting root development, which is a micro way to heal local water cycles. So the first thing about noticing water cycles in the landscape of your farm is it effective or ineffective? So are you getting, during heavy rainfall events, it's easy to stay inside and look out at the rain, but you're far better off getting outside and getting your coat on. So in our climate, we get up to 2,800 mil of rain a year. But what we're seeing with climate change over the last few years is that the rains are becoming more and more unpredictable. So we've had years in the last 6 years that are as low as 1400 mil of rain. So that's a massive variation. And then crucially within the year, what we're seeing is whether it's a low overall annual precipitation or a high overall annual precipitation, what we're seeing is that when the droughts come, when the dry spells come, like this dry spell we're about to enter into, they're hotter and more prolonged. And when the rain comes at the end of it, the inundation events are more severe. So we need the ability of our farmscapes, of the landscapes within which we farm, to be able to absorb those shocks, whether it's an inundation event, to kind of slow the flow. Where water wants to run, we like to make it walk. So we're big fans of putting in features in the landscape like ponds that hold water back and slowly bleed it out to the natural stream and river network over time, or agroforestry systems which encourage infiltration rather than runoff. In certain areas of the farm, actually an ineffective water cycle, one where that soil unit is completely inundated with water for most of the year, may be desirable. We have some rare habitats on the farm that support various moths and butterflies and invertebrates that we've actually chosen to kind of honor. We talk about honoring the niche. So in those particular areas, we're not looking to heal. We're not looking to make everything grassland. We're looking to honor exactly what that landscape needs to be or wants to be, because working with nature is always the lowest entropy approach. Next one there, Brona.
Yep.
So what is a weed? So in our context, we believe that nothing exists in nature by accident. So if we're seeing species show up in a large number or in an undesirable location, we don't attack it. We don't attack it because it's just a symptom of a scenario that we've created. So the analogy often given is taking an aspirin for a headache, and then after you take the aspirin, continuing to hit yourself on the head with a wooden stick. So you're creating the problem by hitting yourself on the head. You're creating the problem through either grazing practices or how you're managing your soil unit in a particular area. And it might be inhibiting a water cycle or a nutrient cycle. And nature's response to that is to put up these species that exist in those exact niches that you've created. So the two examples that we get asked about all the time are thistles and rushes. So a thistle can be there because of a mid-level compaction in a soil unit, and can also be there because of a mineral imbalance. And the soft rush, Juncus diffusus, is there because you have an ineffective water cycle. You've anaerobic conditions created at quite a shallow lens within your soil column. So these are the indicating species. Now, in a conventional mindset, we might go out there and we might spray, or we might top, or we might, pull them, or we might do something with them. But when we interrupt the life cycle of these so-called weed species, we're also interrupting nature's own cycle of healing. So these species will show up when the conditions are perfect. But if you ever cut through a thistle, you'll see what you'll be met with is a woody outer sheath and a hollow sphere. And we've carried out this experiment a couple of times on the farm now, where we've taken fields back from conventional grazing management. We've seen the population of thistles climb and climb and climb into year 3 and then plateau, and we've deliberately done nothing with them. The only thing we might do is at the very end of the season, once they're about to set seed, we might go in and just trample over them, crack the stem, but we do nothing else. We allow them to express themselves fully. And after year 3 into year 4, what we've noticed is that population crashes and goes away. And we believe it's because the underlying problem has been addressed through the evolution of the thistle in that particular area. And we've seen that time and time again on the farm. So when we see thistles show up, we don't see many nowadays. We saw a lot in the early days of this farming project when we took the farm back in from conventional management. But we see an odd one every now and then. And the same with rushes as well. When you switch over to a long grass grazing system that is promoting root development, you're locally fixing that water cycle. So over time, what we see is that the clump of rush itself stops kind of growing in a vigorous manner, because we're not creating bare ground. Any of the seed, either latent within the seed bed or that year's crop of seed, doesn't have the opportunity to get started. and over time that clump of rushes in an area will just desist. And that's the only time actually where we'll go in and we might do some mulching on areas, but that's the only time we'll kind of do the intervening, and it's just to speed up the process of that of rushes from disappearing from our system. Next one, please, Bren.
Okay.
So with water cycles, it's important to think at all scales of the spectrum. So from macro, so if you're living at the top of a catchment and you've got a depression mid-slope, like there's probably nothing. Well, you can throw money, time, effort, and energy at it, and you can drain the hell out of it and completely change that system. But you have to kind of ask yourself, is it worth all of that effort? So when you're thinking macro, thinking about the most appropriate ways to work with the landform and how water flowing across your landscape is interacting with your farm. If you encounter an area where water is pooling, what we tend to do is we tend to ask ourselves first and foremost, okay, there is a problem here. 2, should our role be to improve the water cycle, i.e. get water off as quickly as possible in that area, or is it actually more advantageous for us to impede the water cycle further and create a pond here? So very often on that kind of thought process, we've created ponds that are higher up in the catchment or higher up in slope on certain parts of our farm unit that have allowed us to passively water cattle without the use of pumps, or and actually create another niche habitat, free water space, free water area on the farm, which then invites in a whole plethora of biodiversity. And then on the macro end of the spectrum, better roots equal better water cycling. And as you're promoting long grass grazing, as I said before, you grow tall plants, you're growing deeper roots, and all of that works toward building a deeper living soil column. So you're reclaiming more and more of that soil column back from the subsoil, back from the kind of dead anaerobic compacted layer into a living, breathing part of your farm system. Next slide.
Okay. Oh, that is slow, sorry.
Very, yeah, that's all right. Here we go. And crucially, this is it for me. It's what we see in our kind of our climate, where we do get a lot of rainfall, and we are typically grazing very, very tight, and we're not promoting that root development. We're not healing water cycles on a macro or a micro scale. We get this drop in pH as soils go anaerobic. And as most of us will know here, when it drops in pH, we get this phenomena of nutrient lockup. So the nutrients that are kind of endemic within the soil aren't available for the plants to access, and this is because there is a decrease in the biological complexity of the soil food web that's able to liberate those pools of nutrients and move them from bioavailable to or bio-unavailable to bioavailable forms. So we get this nutrient lockup that happens. So when we begin to fix water cycles, when we begin to heal those water cycles locally, either through long grass grazing or through capturing water and distributing it over the landscape in a more effective manner through the use of swales or agroforestry systems or ponds, what we do is we encourage an aerobic system to exist within our soil units. And as we get more and more of the aerobes into our soil system, we see that pH creep up and up and up, which then opens up a broader spectrum of nutrients available to us. And what we see is, through time, we see higher order forage species coming into the pasture. So these are latent in our seed bed. When we create that living kind of compost mulch over our paddock areas, we're creating the perfect conditions that lock in moisture and raise the temperature just enough to allow germination to take place. And if the conditions are right in terms of the presence of aerobes and a good potential for gas exchange in our soil, then those plants just fly. And that's what drives the ecological complexity of our forage species. Next one, Bren.
Yeah.
So a big inspiration for me on this journey, which I encountered about 15 years ago, was the Pont Bren project, which is in the high up in the uplands in Wales. So a very similar climate to ours. They get north of 3 meters of rain a year. This was a farmer-led approach that was born of an observation, and the observation was that water appeared to be infiltrating better on slope below woodland or hedgerow systems than it did in grass. So you know, when those big inundation events come, rather than allowing water to sheet off our land and cause issues with erosion and downstream effects of pollution due to that erosion, it's how do we get water to, how do we slow the flow, how do we get water to infiltrate rather than sheet off? So an observation was made and then studied, and it was born that water infiltrates about 60-70 times faster below hedgerow systems than it does below grass. So Pont Bren is the picture on the left there, which is they've designed this network of hedgerows high up in the catchment to encourage water infiltration higher up. And what that means is you're locking, because you're encouraging water to go into your soil. If you couple this with long grass grazing, what you're doing is you're putting all that water away, you're storing it at a molecular level within your soil structure, so that in the times of drought, you have it there available in that soil carbon sponge for your plants to access, which means that you're not just improving the situation during those heavy downpour events, but you're also improving the situation during those times of drought. And of course, the other benefits are shelter creation. So when you're on these high exposed sites, there's a wind speed. If you can slow that wind speed or create an area where animals can get in behind and shelter from the worst effects of that weather, then they're not having to expend as much. You know, that they maintain their thrive and their vigor. And then in addition to that, again, you've got the access to fodder species and in your tree belts. So we loved all that so much that that's kind of the model that we've used in implementing what you see on the right there, which is the example of our own agroforestry system here on the farm. Next one there, Brona.
Okay.
So 3 quick ones here. The tree systems in our farm, you'll see this image on the bottom right there. There is a young alder, which is growing up. Alder is a fabulous tree for our climate. It's a real thug. It grows super vigorously. It likes to grow in areas that have ineffective water cycles, so it doesn't mind being in anaerobic conditions. But crucially, it's leguminous. It has that relationship with colonies of microbes that form nodules on its root system that take gaseous nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it through a natural process and then make it available to the soil food web. So it's an incredible nitrogen dump into our pastures. And you can see as we move our cattle through our young agroforestry systems, what we're doing is we're just running a single line of polywire, and because we're moving them through quick, they don't bother the trees. Next slide.
Yeah.
The little mice go to work.
That's crazy slow.
Mm-hmm. Cool. When our systems, this is an example of our shelter belt system. When our systems get to a certain stage, and it's usually around 3-inch kind of diameter of stem, and the trees are usually about 10 foot, maybe 14 feet in height, depending on the species, we're not precious about them. So we will quite happily incorporate them into our rotational grazing system, and we'll kind of crash graze through these systems, through the shelter belt systems, as kind of routine. The trees in this particular picture were at the bottom of a slope that had seen a lot of erosion through some close grazing with sheep over many, many decades. These were planted about 7 years ago, and when I was planting them, it was very difficult even to get the spade into the ground to actually get the whip into the ground. And when you go in there now, because of the action of the root and because of our grazing philosophy promoting that root development through tall grass grazing, what you find is a nice spongy soil layer that can actually take water and drink it down, and it's no longer the anaerobic super hard layer that was there once before. So another reason why trees are awesome, particularly integrated into these systems. Next slide.
What size were they when you put them in?
They were like 2 foot, around 600 mil.
No way. Oh gosh.
Key to that actually is planting them at ultra high density, but we can go into that a little bit later. If you plant trees farther apart, it takes them longer to make those associations with their neighbors and with the mycorrhizal network, and they don't seem to be as vigorous in their growth phase, particularly early on.
That's interesting.
Many parts of our farm are kind of wilder. You know, they're typically they're deemed as scrub. There's all sorts of negative language used around them, but we see them as real benefits. They're real, like, islands, havens of biodiversity. And there are areas of the farm that we might not graze from one year to the other. It might be 2 or 3 years before we go in. But the point is that we always have them in our back pocket. So these areas that are kind of wilder, that have evolved just through natural regeneration, we would quite happily, in times of drought, for example, if we were finding it a bit tight on one particular part of our grazing platform, there's a whole buffet there just waiting for us that requires no input at all, and the cattle love it. So they can go in, they get access to a diversity of forage species, everything from raspberry, salmonberry, you know, all the kind of canes that grow around, to even gorse. They love gorse at certain times of the year, nettle, all sorts of alder and willow, of course. And this is all down to the as we're surmising, down to the zoo pharmacognosy. So the animals that are self-medicating during the year. And an example of that is when we bring the animals back onto that kind of grass rush pasture after the winter. If there's any patch of nettles at all, they'll go straight for them and they'll just devour them completely, strip them of the young leaf. If we bring them back onto a patch later on in the year, later on in the season, and there's a patch of nettles, they mightn't even go near them at all. So it's really interesting that at different times of the year, when offered the opportunity, the animal is selectively grazing as to what it needs, which is of course very different from a conventional kind of grassland monoculture or a low diversity sward. And we love the hashtag cows in trees, which I think originated by Nikki Yoxel. When you put these animals into a wooded system like this, they just chill out. You can almost feel the energy dropping. They go into a really relaxed state, and they're just they're just in a really, really happy place. So the next slide, I think, is the last slide, and I will be quiet. Three key points to take away. One is, like, for us, it's know your context. It's understand where you're starting from, of course, but know where you want to go, and really define that as a guiding kind of principle, as a North Star, because it filters from your year-to-year planning to your intra-season planning, right down to your day-to-day decision making, knowing where you're going. So for us, building complexity is number one. Like, we really have to think long and hard if we're going to take any action on the farm that we know is going to result in reducing the complexity in a localized area. The second is observe. So I would invite you to use all of your senses. I'm well known for asking people on farm walks here to get out of their shoes and wellies and go barefoot, because you can really tell something about the ground through how springy it is. You know, you can interpret the aspects of a system in many, many different ways. So touch, smell, taste, feel, use whatever you can use. And crucially, don't be afraid to interact. So we did our initial grazing experiments on 4 acres, and then we scaled to 40. We're now at 120. And our goal is to get to the full extent of the farm, which is 400 acres. But we need a lot more animals to do that. But we're proving the concepts. We're dipping our toe. And once we have confidence in an approach and in a philosophy, we're quite happy to double down on it. But the other side of that is don't spread yourself too thin. Don't try and do everything all at once. So we've really, really focused on the grazing here, because we've been able to prove year on year that it works for us in our context, and we're willing to do it. It's something that we enjoy doing. It's not for everybody. It's very, very context specific. So what I'm saying today isn't the golden bullet that will work for everybody, but I'm just sharing experiences to illustrate that it works for us. And then the final point is diversity is resilience. Nature builds resilience through diversity and through adding more nodes to the network and through encouraging interconnection through those nodes. So we try to do that every day by making sure that we're monitoring biodiversity between years and over longer cycles as well, over 5-year cycles, to ensure that we are in fact regenerating a system and not degenerating it. But it also comes to play in terms of, you know, involving members of the community into the farm, and you know, educating people about these kind of processes, these kind of conversations that ultimately ends up in, you know, beef on their plate on a Sunday. So we find it really useful and actually quite encouraging to engage with schools and community groups. We run volunteer days here on the farm as well, and we're always open for a farm walk if anyone's ever passing, so you'd be very welcome to call in. And also income as well. So we've got a number of different income streams to the farm. We have a small herd at the moment, but we have ambitions to grow that, and we're proving the concept that we can grow that without having to get into the realms of a lot of debt and a lot of expensive inputs. We have ambitions to grow it, and that ultimately means we have a pathway to even more profitability. But we also run events on the farm. We do, you know, we work with Donegal ETB, the Education and Training Board, to kind of further the discussions around regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture here in Ireland. So it's important not to put all of your eggs in one basket. We talk about resilience through diversity in an ecological sense, but it's also important to kind of carry those same ethics across into financial sense as well. And yeah, I think the last slide is just our contact details. There's an email there. We're on social media at Future Oak Farm. And if you go onto our website, futureoakfarm.ie, you can find a like a mailing list thing, and we have resources, like a resource pack that will accompany this presentation for this evening. So if you want to sign up there, we'll happily send you a copy of the slides and some of the kind of key texts and links to videos and stuff that have informed our philosophy along the way. So thanks for your time.
Ah, that's brilliant. Love that photo at the end. Okay. So I made some notes. I'm not going to go through all of this, but that long grass, I think, is something that is a massive misconception in the industry. It's something that unless you get your head around the way you explain it, everything they've been taught in agriculture is do not let that happen at all counts, because you've lost all of your feed value and the kind of conversion of how that works in the rumen. And I think the way you described it tonight was brilliant, because it is really looking at that, getting that seed head to go higher and higher so that you have more leaf. So you really build in, because I always thought about it before as kind of like the power of the biology pumping sugars, that you were still keeping a feed value in it. But it's I think that's a real key one for a lot of general farmers to get their head around.
Yeah, so, and you need to get used to, you need to be comfortable looking at your fields and seeing them in a scruffy state. Often that's the biggest challenge, is people are so used to looking at uniform, closely clipped pastures. And don't get me wrong, I get that warm fuzzy feeling as well when I see it. When I see that uniformity, it's nice. But often when you go into those pastures and you look directly down as opposed to looking obliquely, or you find a high percentage of bare ground, and you don't find that in our system at all. So the trade-off is getting used to it looking a wee bit scruffy and a wee bit unruly.
And not caring what the neighbours think at all.
That's the big one.
If anything, getting a kick out of them gossiping about you.
Yeah.
Is there anyone have any questions? Just unmute yourselves and jump in.
Hiya.
Hey.
You're planning your ponds and agroforestry. How much, I suppose, was there a particular system for planning them that you used, or you just go by more sort of your knowledge of the land, or how much did you do on paper, I suppose?
Quite a lot. So when I was in my kind of discovery phase, around the time I discovered holistic management, I was taken with the work of P.A. Yeomans, who was the originator of the keyline design philosophy, who was an Australian lad who his whole thing was all about kind of getting water to infiltrate where it falls from the sky. So where it impacts the earth, get it to infiltrate as quickly as possible. So he developed this. One element of his design philosophy is something called keyline design or keyline patterning. So I studied that, and although it was developed for an arid climate, I could see applications for it here, because the underlying principles are exactly the same, encouraging water to get into the soil column rather than running off and essentially rehydrates. And then if the carbon was there, if we were promoting that root development, then we've created this soil carbon sponge that holds onto the water in times of drought. So I used the keyline. I went out, because I'm such a nerd, I conducted a manual survey at 500 mil in contour intervals across 8 acres, which took a long time. I did it manually with a laser level, and then I went and flagged every point of contour, and then went back with a $20 Garmin GPS device and picked up every point as well, imported all of that into Google Earth, and from that base contour survey at 500 mil, I was able to design the system. Thankfully, through the advances in drone technology, you can do that work that took me about 3 weeks. You can do that now in a couple of hours. So I use the keyline design framework to inform the design of that system. And then when it came to selecting tree species to go into the system, when you look at soils from a successional perspective, early successional soils or soils that have been disturbed recently are massively bacterially dominated. And late succession soils, the kind that we find woodland on, are massively fungally dominated. So one of the hardest things you'll ever do is try to introduce complex agroforestry systems into a grassland system, because they really struggle in the early years because the fungal element isn't there. So what we did here was we focused on putting in pioneer species. So we focused on our alders, we focused on willow, and we focused on poplar to go into the system, and birch to go into the system first. We've given them now 5 years. That system is in, and next year will be year 5. We're also doing biological assays on the farm to see what that bacterial fungal ratio is. And we're adding wood chip to that system all the time as a mulch on an annual basis. So once that point begins to tip, then we'll be confident enough to add in our kind of later successional target species. And the goal for that system is fruit and nut crops in the long term. But if we were to plant, 20, 30 euro fruit trees in from day one, a lot of them would fail. So what we're trying to do is put in the groundwork to shift that bacterial fungal ratio, so they've got a better chance of success when they do go in.
Thank you.
It's a really good agroforestry tip. I haven't heard that one.
Doesn't that help our impatience?
Yeah, patience is
But yeah, it makes sense.
Is something, yeah. I mean, what's driving all of this is, like, we have the ambition to do this system. So you need to have the vision, and you need to have the money, and then time is the other part of the equation. If you have a lot of money, then you can reduce the time, but we don't have a lot of money, so we have to be patient. So that all of that agroforestry, and there's all sorts of great grants and supports out there now for agroforestry, but at the time when I was designing that system, there were none, and particularly none that wanted it to look like that, like as a fully integrated system that was going to assist with grazing planning, and was going to assist with water management across the site, and was going to assist with shelter creation. Everyone wanted to, at the time, wanted you to plant in a grid fashion, which wouldn't have helped me in my context at all. So we had to do the whole thing on a shoestring, but it's made us creative and patient.
Hi, Richard.
Yeah, that was a great presentation, great thinking, and great action back on the farm. My question is if you could explain a little bit more about your trip transect surveys, or whatever you briefly describe, because monitoring seems to be such an important thing that's so little done. Tell me more about your trip surveys.
Yeah, sure. So at the time, I guess it might serve to illustrate the point better if I rewind the clock a little bit. So when I watched Allan Savory's TED Talk, I was completely blown away by it. And my next action was to buy the book. And I bought the book and tried to read it. And it's such heavy going, I threw it from me. I wasn't ready for it. So I would say to anybody who's kind of regen curious or holistic management curious, buy the book and have a go. But if you can't digest it, don't worry about it. And one of the big parts that were missing at that time in the evolution of holistic management was what we now call ecological outcome verification, the EOV process, which is now a defined, scientific, statistically robust model to prove that a site is regenerating. So, of course, when you start bunching animals and just applying the principle without any kind of oversight, without any kind of plan or big fancy grazing chart, which we now have, you're going to see these changes in quick order, just like I did with the sheep in between year 1 and year 2. So you're gonna be able to know intuitively that the system is improving in complexity. But what I did at the time was I was kind of in touch with some people in the UK with a company called 3LM, and they're kind of the Savory hub for Britain, basically. And they were talking about the development of this process EOV, and I was kind of listening. And I'm not an ecologist by training at all, but I could understand the concept of a transect survey. So it's just 2 fixed points ideally across the longest axis in your pasture unit, and ideally that straight line is going to intersect as many ecological niches that might be reflective of that environment. So that's the first point, is understand where you're starting and where you're going to, and that those points are removable. So for me, it was quite easy. It was a gate post at the corner of the gate when I came into the field, and it was the far left corner. It was a very, very simple one, and it was a run of probably, on that site, which was 4 acres, it was a run of probably 200 meters or so. The second point of it, now this is before the whole EOV system was formalized, and it's a much more rigorous process now, was to create a fixed point of a known unit area. So I created just a kind of square kind of wooden thing that you would throw at random, and this is like high school ecology. So you throw it at random, you know, take I was taking 50 points along this 200-meter line. Wherever it would land, I would characterize on a number of levels exactly what was there. So I would look at it and say, right, how much bare ground do I have as a percentage? How much moss do I have as a percentage? How many forbs do I have? You know, the flat leaf species as a percentage. What grasses do I have here? What's the diversity within each of those units? And to this day, I'm still no good at. There's probably 4 or 5 species in my paddocks that I can name by sight, but I'm not amazing at it at all. But it's not necessarily important what the Latin name are for each of these taxa. It's more important to kind of get a handle on the metrics involved. And it's quite an easy process, and it's a particularly nice one to do. You've got to kind of do it at either multiple times in the season or at the same point in the season year after year. But it's quite an easy process to do, and as long as there's repeatability in the process, then your data actually means something to you. Now, what we're looking for here is metrics that convince us. What we're looking here is for feedback of the system at the earliest possible opportunity, just to tell us whether or not we're on the right track. So as long as that number is going up and up and up, we know that we're on the right track. We know that as long as the metric for moss is going down and the number of forb or grassland species is going up, we had confidence to continue the experiment. If we'd have seen any of those numbers indicating that we're going off track, it would have required further investigation, a different observation, maybe increasing the frequency of observations through in the year, and ultimately using that insight, what we're learning kind of on the ground, on the go, because we're looking to rapidly iterate our decision making. We would use that insight if we didn't get the expected outcome to ultimately revisit some of our day-to-day management decisions And in the context of those early experiments with sheep, that might have been playing around with, maybe I give them bigger areas, maybe I give them smaller areas, maybe I move them on 24-hour or 36-hour periods instead of a 6 or 12-hour period. These are some of the variables that we could play with.
Very good. Thank you.
Have you done any measuring on your land, Richard?
Well, I happen to be one of the holistic management educators here in California, and I'm still in training as far as I'm concerned. So I appreciate learning from other people on what they're doing that makes sense to them. We tend to focus here, or at least I do, on a lot of, we call them rancher to rancher gatherings. Maybe there you would call them farmer to farmer, where we focus on facilitated conversation among farmers themselves. We work under the assumption there are no experts in managing this kind of complexity, and people are more comfortable with that than people that come in and tell them what to do that will help them, because it usually doesn't. So that's a different approach I have to managing holistically that seems to work well. People get to learn at their own pace. They get to focus on the topic that's really of interest to them, whether it's weeds, whether it's monitoring, whether it's the money and costs involved. That's where I think the great creativity is, unleashing that amongst the farmers themselves.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. Like within the Irish context, I grew up in a time where my father and the kind of neighbors around here would always revert to, we have an organization here, a farming organization here called Chagas, which is like a farm advisory kind of service. And they would always revert to the people that had the degrees, that knew agricultural science, you know. And when I look back on that philosophically, it was a disempowering action. You were asking people to kind of, you may have casually made an observation about what was happening in your land, but ultimately it was the man with it, or it was typically a man, but ultimately it was the man with the degree that was going to tell you what to do and how many bags of fertilizer to put on. And it further drove a wedge between people and connection with the land that they were custodians of. And I think this, for me, in this whole process, it's observation. So that observe and interact thing, it's the observation part of it that is the key to re-empowering people to actually try something. And, you know, what are you tuning into, and is your gut assumption correct? Well, let's trial it on a small scale, and if it is, then let's double down on it. You know, let's chase those small wins and see if we can really turn the system around. Because ultimately, it's that day-to-day iteration, I feel, that moves at a far greater, more impactful pace than science can.